So I've been discussing a piece called Displacements that was a work of performance and an installation that I made with a lot of help from a lot of other people in sometime in the late 80s. And this piece addressed a number of different issues, including homelessness in San Diego where I was living, including access to public spaces and to spaces of intellectual interest and spaces of educational spaces as well for individuals with different kinds of disabilities. It addressed public spaces in general. It addressed issues of the display of art and differences in, for example, public spaces that are owned and in which art is seen as a belonging or a possession. I'm talking about spaces like museums and in some sense, gallery spaces, depending on what type of gallery you're talking about. Publications versus presentations. The differences between what it means to write and then writing as an inscription versus verbalizing as a performance. So you could say textualizing versus playing in a sense, like for example, so if you present someone's work, a musician's work on YouTube, you're beholden to the authority of whoever owns particular copyright and a lot of channels of ownership and property. But if you play, a tune by, say, John Coltrane in a jazz club or a bar or wherever, you're very unlikely to be called on your handling of this material. So, there are ways in which culture frames what ownership is and what presentation is. Now, even though, when you're making something, you're very much more like John Coltrane playing a tune in a jazz club than you are like a publisher publishing a work. But if you try to put that somewhere that you made, that piece that you made or played or performed or whatever, you could still, run into those restrictions of ownership. Anyway, this work addressed those issues, but the main reason that I was returning to it was because it addressed issues of trauma, including violent trauma, and not just the trauma of accidents, but the trauma of inflicted violence upon individuals by other individuals for whatever reason: racism, prejudice, bias, sense that someone is not a part of a community. And I wanted to address all kinds of traumatic experiences, including the ways that trauma is repeated from one traumatic event to another, and there's a kind of ripple effect. We're going to talk about that today because this was one of the ideas that I had in one of the definitions of displacement, is this repetition of trauma, how that emerges and why that occurs through this kind of aspect of displacement, psychological definition of displacement. But I'll weed out, some of that in the way that I narrate what I do. I think I've put enough material into play that I can elaborate this as a kind of theater. Hopefully I can do that because that's my intention. So I was concerned, with this particular issue of trauma right now because with the rise of neo-fascism, we experienced 4 years of basically endless trauma every time Trump did something that was a threat to any of us who felt the threat, and it was pretty much perpetual. And not that these threats don't exist in American culture all of the time, but there are certain kinds of authority that can heighten the experience of the feelings of these trauma, and there are certain kinds of authorities who can mitigate it. One of the ways that it's mitigated is if we feel safe, if we feel that we're not threatened when we go outside every day. So if you're an Asian American and your president is referring to all things that belong to China and Chinese in a derogatory manner, and this inspires a group of really prejudiced and biased Americans to become hostile and violent against all Asian Americans, then you feel yourself in a heightened zone of danger and threat, and you relived your traumas, whether or not you are actually assaulted that day or not, because the threat is increased and it's ever present, it's constant. And the same goes for African Americans who live under heightened threat in times when a president belittles activists like Colin Kaepernick, who takes a stand against police violence against African Americans, which we should all, take a stand is probably the wrong word, unfortunately, in this case, because the act itself was to bend one's knee, right? At those moments in the NFL games in which the national anthem was played. And I'm gonna take a little aside here because I think this aside is really necessary, okay? So one of the consequences of being a sensitive person is sometimes you have deep feelings about certain things, and it's difficult to suppress those feelings. And I have those feelings about certain things. And one of the things is actually, it might be surprising for some people who know me, but I tend to cry when the national anthem is played. And, so when it comes on and it's played in a respectful way, I bow my head and kind of hide my eyes, and I respond in the same way that I would respond in prayer. So I used to go out, for breakfast almost every day before the coronavirus, and this was during the Trump presidency. And there was this little place in Descanso, California, which is a few miles from where I lived in Julian, California, and I used to have breakfast. And they would play this radio station, and every morning at a certain time when I was there having breakfast, the national anthem would come on, and I would bow my head, and I would have this experience of this moving feeling that I have. And this was like more or less like a very Trumpy, venue. Okay, we're not talking about some place in Brooklyn that whose clientele is largely liberal or radical or Democrat or heterogeneous socially, and this was very much Trump country, right? Okay, so just to let everybody know, like everybody in the restaurant other than myself, they just went about their business, okay? They didn't stop and pay respect to the national anthem. They just went about their business. And if they were in the middle of swearing about something, they continued to swear about something, okay? So it wasn't, so Trump's performance about how this was disrespectful was utter nonsense, okay? It was just a deployment against African Americans to say, no, you don't have the right to say that, right? So a full awareness on his part, and he's been aware of it, right, since he went after the Central Park Five, who were innocent boys that he basically put a death, he put an advertisement in the New York Times to basically have these children executed, right? Never apologized for it, never, it was like a racist act of violence, right? Inciting racist violence against African Americans is what he's really, really good at. And he's totally aware, too, that the stage of issues of change and challenge to racist policies that are either written into the law or unwritten parts of culture have always taken place in the theater and arena of sports, from Jesse Owens in the Olympics, to Jackie Robinson, to Muhammad Ali, to, it goes on and on and on. So it's like not an accident at all, right? And my anecdote about the place that I used to go to breakfast was just there like as an insistence that, it never comes up as an issue for these people unless it's a matter of racist violence, right? They don't really care about the national anthem. I'll testify to that. Okay, so anyway, these relived traumas and this climate, inspired me to return to this piece. And the other reason that I wanted to return to the piece, beyond investigating what I did with trauma at that time, and what I've continued to do with trauma over the decades that followed with my work, is I wanted to address this other part of the piece that was a pretty significant element of it, which had to do with in engaging especially performative arts and dramatic arts, but I had in mind like the world as a kind of theatrical stage, or theater of the universe, theater of our world, right? And I wanted to engage these issues of, when do we participate versus when do we step back and act as mere spectators? And what are the moral implications if, we are spectators to, say, racial violence or violence motivated by some other factor, and we remain spectators? Now, there's a lot of different ways to participate. I mean, the most obvious way to participate in the spectacle of violence is to stop it. And sometimes we do that, right? I remember when I never became a high school teacher, but I was training to become a high school teacher. And then what got in the way of that was, for whatever reason, it was a requirement that one had to get through college level algebra to become a literature teacher. And I had avoided that because I have this particular disability that is called dysgraphia that makes sequencing numbers really difficult. And I had gone really far out of my way, both in high school and in university, to avoid taking math classes. And I was able to do that at UCSD, but there were consequences later that I wasn't aware that I was going to face. Anyway, so that never happened. But I was trained, and I did my internship in Brooklyn, and at Brooklyn Technical High School. And one day, two young men that I knew were high school students because I had seen them, in the school. They weren't my students. I wasn't teaching them, but I had recognized them. And they were getting into a scuffle in the subway. I was taking the subway back to Astoria, Queens. And I could tell that it was about to exceed its verbal ability to be contained its ability to be contained in verbal insults and pass into physical violence. It was right at the edge of that. So I kind of like jumped in the middle and I said, hey, let's not do this. And one of the young men, said, who are you? Who are you? Are you a cop? And I said, no, I'm not a cop. I'm a teacher. And he wanted to argue about that I wasn't his teacher. And I said, look, I'm a teacher and that's what I do. So I'm a teacher if I'm in the classroom, and I'm a teacher here in the subway, and we don't really need to do this. And he backed down, and then the other young men backed down, more quickly than that. He actually had recognized me. I had been, observing one of the classes he was in, so he was great. And then later I said, thanks for, showing, your maturity and this. Okay, so that's one kind of participatory action that we would hope that we always have the courage to make. But some people do and some people don't, right? So that's not gonna always be, we're not always gonna have the ability to do that in every instance. Another example that's come up a lot is well, if it's the police and they're armed, you can't fight the police. Like I'll be the first one to admit it. I've been assaulted by police officers on more than one occasion, and I have very, very consciously not defended myself. And the reason for that is because if you defend yourself, it's very likely that you'll be killed, right? You'll probably be tased anyway, even if you don't defend yourself, right? But if you defend yourself, you're just, like they're not gonna stop, right? So you can't win. And even if you won, and then what did you win? Because you'll just be put in jail for the rest of your life, so you can't win. So these are instances in which you literally can't engage in that way and stop something like this. And I know that there's like a lot of guilt and trauma around that too. What does it mean to be spectator to this kind of violence that you can't intercede in, that you can't make a difference in? That's a very difficult thing. To be a witness to violence and not to be able to respond to it. So, what we've seen, is a lot of people that have managed, to at least film it. And, now everybody has cell phones. My cell phone doesn't work as a phone right now, but everybody else has cell phones. And one of the ways that, and people have this, survivor guilt from like being witnesses to these spectacles as well. It's not only that we're being murdered, it's that, we're witnesses to it all the time. And that is super traumatizing too. So, one of the ways that people have responded is that, fortunately, is, they've made videos. If they've seen this thing, if you see it, film it. And, this is basically, honestly, if the violence against George Floyd hadn't been filmed, and if the violence against a few other people hadn't been filmed, there probably wouldn't even have been cases. It wouldn't even made it to court, And the fact that Derek Chauvin was, prosecuted was, it still doesn't solve the environment of this kind of mentality, but it's still to some extent heartening, that that something could happen. What's disheartening, I guess, is you look back and whatever it was, 43% of the Republicans think that, he's innocent because they can't get over their bigotry and biases. But and no amount of evidence will ever change their mind, So so these works that I'm, creating and that deal with these issues, can only, affect so far. And maybe they're not even there, to change people's minds. Maybe they're just there to be a part of the conversation in order to get people thinking about, well, what ways do the conversations expand our consciousness of these issues? Like in what ways can we talk about these things? And, what ways does discussion and does work, affect the future? So anyway, these were some of the reasons why I wanted to return. And then in returning, I've been defining certain aspects of this word displacement that I used. And today we've reached the point where I want to engage the Freudian or post-Freudian or, psychological definition of the word displacement. And the one, that's familiar with everyone is the one that's narrated in that James Joyce short story called Counterparts from Dubliners, right? So this Irish worker in Dublin, I assume, because it's Dubliners, gets yelled at by his boss and demeaned, like belittled and demeaned, and we've all had, that experience from a boss at some point, if we've even had a boss. I know I've had that experience from many bosses. But he comes home and he has a little boy. He has a child, and he beats the child. And counterparts, means that they occupy the same space in abuse. And what displacement is that all of these negative emotions that this man has that beats his child in this story, and the anger and the frustration, it all, instead of being returned from where it came upon the boss, who he needs to keep his job in order for his family to survive. He can't hit him in the mouth. He can't speak back to him. He's incapacitated in his ability to defend himself, just like what? Just like we are when the police attack us, incapacitated in our ability to defend ourselves. Or if the president of the United States attacks you, incapacitated in your ability to defend yourself. Because why? Because, well, the entire GOP supports, someone like Trump, no matter what he does or says, no matter what. And so you're totally incapacitated, and then the frustration's got to go somewhere, right? That's what I guess meditation is for, or so many people now pretend to be Christians, and I guess Jesus had a solution for this, right? He said, turn the other cheek. The problem is that if you turn the other cheek and you're still angry, where does it go, right? So turning the other cheek doesn't just mean that you don't hit the boss or the Roman or whoever is striking you. It means that somehow, like, you absorb all of this negativity and you transform it into something positive. And that's precisely what, Trump's base doesn't do, right? It's constantly like channeling hatred and aggression and violent impulses and redirecting it toward what? Toward, subjects that are safe to respond to, Asians, because why? Because the coronavirus has created this context of fear, and we don't know what's going to happen, and people have died, and we need someone to blame. So, this aspect of displacement can easily attach itself to the idea of scapegoating. Who do we scapegoat? We scapegoat people that aren't like ourselves, that are in positions that we somehow feel safe, challenging, not higher ups, but rather people that are dispossessed or disempowered. So a lot of different, historically, categories of, the racial other, the immigrant, the homeless person, the mentally ill, the disabled, all of those people, basically, right? Because this is one of the mechanisms that fascism utilizes so well. Basically, all of those people that the Nazis rounded up and put into concentration camps under Hitler's Germany, and in the Holocaust. So this is the mechanism, and this is how it works and how it gets attached to bigotry and biases in all these different areas. That's the simple version, and then you could put things like fetishization under this category. I think Jacobson associates it with metonymy, and say that you have these erotic feelings for someone, and for some reason that you're uncomfortable with those feelings, like either that it challenges who you feel that you are in terms of your gender or your gender sexuality continuum, or that it is an individual that is For some other reason, you feel uncomfortable having these feelings for, whether it's a friend's wife or whatever, and this person wears their hair in a certain way, and you start to fetishize that hairstyle or whatever it is. I mean, this could be like an example of this kind of psychological displacement where the content that is associated with a particular, say in Freudian terminology, object, either of desire or something else, like returns to you with these negative affects or qualities that your consciousness doesn't want to absorb into. This is who I am, and somehow that gets displaced, via re-identification of another object as sexually safe or authorized, or however you put it. On a larger scale, attached to processes. So what's a process? Well, I was in a process of integration. Who am I? Identification is like is a integration process, right? Us and them. So you might not think much about what your community is or who you are or where you belong, but suddenly you're placed in a different context, and your identity, you don't feel like you belong there, right? So there's like fear or whatever, because everyone else seems to be different from who you are, or whatever that is, whatever that means. And so you find a way of dealing, with your fears or your anger or whatever it might be. So if you, for example, people are out of work, right? And because of the coronavirus, and have to stay home, and suddenly, why you want to know why this is happening, and you find somebody to blame. So again, like scapegoating can work in terms of a process, process of integrating and self-acceptance, as well as it, in terms of that mechanism of identifying, anger, which would be like the content, right? The content of what would we say? The content of affect that one can't relieve oneself of, right, needs to be displaced. But in this other example, I'm kind of wanting to go beyond that and say there's also in this underlying way in which we integrate ourselves into different aspects of the social, a need kind of to make a fit between what our model of self is and what our model of larger community is. And if that is threatened, then it seems to me that like displacement can become one of the ways in which the discomfort of being, outside, or being uncomfortable with the outsider, gets handled. So that, I'm not really going to, get into all of the refined details of the way that different aspects of the psychological community and psychiatric community deals with this term, but I think that should cover it, fairly well enough. In the piece that I was completing in the 80s called Displacements, one of the big content areas was I had just been assaulted in downtown La Jolla. I was going to school at UCSD, and I was living in La Jolla because it was convenient. And a man, a large white man, older, I don't remember how old he was, late 40s maybe, I don't know. And I was pretty small at the time. I was maybe 140 pounds. And he was pretty big. He must have been like 250 pounds, at least 220. He was very tall and he was overweight, and he's, pretty stocky guy. We learned later that, he was a naval officer somewhere, owned a big house in Bird Rock or something. And he was backing out from, I think it was like a video rental place. And I didn't see him until like the car almost hit me. And I jumped out of the way and said, "Hey, watch it," And so he was really angry. I think, he wasn't looking where he was going because he was angry already. And, jumped out of the car and, it was a big thing. I turned, after, the yelling was done, I turned to walk away. And then I felt myself being pushed, and I was pushed into this brick wall. And, I hit my nose, broke my nose. This was the second time I broke my nose, and this is leading up to the first time that my nose was broken. And so I hit this brick wall really hard. My bottom front teeth were chipped, and one of my top front teeth was knocked out. And then after I hit the wall and I was like, sort of falling to the ground and sort of turning around, he spun me around and then he hit me again. And then he walked back to the car, and then he got in the car and he left, And then there were people there, and mostly they were in shock, and mostly, they didn't, do anything to stop it. Although honestly, like, it happened pretty fast, so I don't know what they really could have done. People were really pretty good about engaging that scene. It's like a kind of theater of violence, right? Once it was done, like offering, like to call an ambulance and they need medical attention and all this stuff, right? And the cops didn't come out, but people in the area were pretty nice. So, it seemed to me as I was analyzing what happened, it's like he couldn't possibly have been angry with me. I mean, it didn't even really make any sense because, he almost hit me, right? So in that sense, I mean, if I was guilty of anything, I was guilty of not being completely like aware of this angry man, backing out. So I was, guilty of inattention in some way, perhaps, And then following that, I mean, when you almost are hit by a car, well, it's natural that you have to get out of the way. So we have these physiological defense mechanisms. One of them is that we have adrenaline. So you're threatened, and if you get hit by a car, at least you're gonna have a broken hip or whatever it is. You might not be killed, but he wasn't going that fast. But you jump out of the way and you feel like, wow, that was a threat of violence, maybe not violence, but it was like a threat of imminent danger, right? So the adrenaline kicks in, and then it's natural. The adrenaline can't just empty itself out completely when it's done. So you're upset. So you yell, right? Like, what are you doing? And you may not use, entirely appropriate language, because the adrenaline's there, and your life was, or maybe not your life, but you were in bodily danger, right? So whatever I responded, and he was more than happy to respond back, very eager to. So the eagerness of the response back and the aggression, and then the escalation of the aggression and the violence and the verbal abuse was a sign that he wasn't angry at me. Something else was going on. So I very much, felt like I was this, Irish child in the James Joyce story Counterparts. And I don't know what happened to him, at work or elsewhere, but I assume that it was something. So anyway, I incorporated that into the piece, and I think it's a good, example of what's going on in a larger social arena, in this moment, where wherever that anger and violence came from, it filters into our lives, and it does so like almost on a daily basis and perpetually. And the other thing that it does, that when it happens, because I had to go to the dentist and I had to get a new tooth, And yeah, my nose was broken, and so I had a, my, here's another, example of a kind of displacement, I guess. The bones in my nose were displaced, and I had some trouble with my sinuses for a number of years after that. But one of the things that it did was that it pushed me into re-experiencing this trauma that I had experienced in 1977, and which was a greater trauma. And I'll talk about why it was a greater trauma. But it had this feeling of like, well, that bell rings, and the vibration of the sound waves, carry to the next bell, and it rings. So the more that we're traumatized, the more bells we have to ring, right? And it's not necessarily even that these traumas are entirely our own. Some of the more significant traumas that I've had in my life have been assaults on people that I care about, not myself. And it sounds strange that that could be a trauma greater than the one in which you're harmed, but think about it. If you're harmed, you physically know the extent to which you're harmed, and to some extent you're aware of the psychological extent to which you have been harmed as well. Whereas when someone that you love is harmed, you don't know. You don't know the devastation inside. You don't know the feelings. And that gap between your concern and your knowledge creates devastating repercussions of I guess I don't want to use the word really, but vicarious trauma. It's more than that. Empathetic trauma. That's the word that we should be talking about. Empathetic trauma. And those of us who care about what happens to people in the United States that we somehow feel like we belong to, have experienced this empathetic trauma, as I say, almost on a daily basis, and it becomes overwhelming, just overwhelming. You can't stand it anymore. I mean, so I've known people who, well, one of the people that I respect most in the world, who's gone, and was a teacher that I had named Dennis Brutus, and Dennis was an activist, and he was an activist in South Africa and against apartheid, and he was very effective at it, and he developed strategies that I still use in my work, and I learned a lot from him. And then he brought that to the United States when he was exiled from South Africa, and continued to work in ways. And he experienced this incredible amount of not only violence, but the threat of being returned to that violence. So for example, when he came here in exile, right? And then there were all of this, there was a big apparatus, to say, well, your visa's expired, we're gonna export you, whatever. And so, and no one wants to take the consequences for these acts, and the sort of racial injustice that surrounds them, and to really admit what it's all about, right? So in part of the deportation orders that he got from the United States, it says, well, we're not going to deport you back to South Africa. We're going to deport you to Britain, since you came here via England. So Maggie Thatcher at the time wasn't real keen on having Dennis seek refuge, right, in the UK. So they said, no, and so there's a chain. It's well, it's not our fault, we just don't want you here. So these acts of displacement, right, and in these acts of displacement where like responsibility and justice are somehow like deferred to the next guy. You know what I mean? And I didn't know, Dennis, obviously in the time, that I made the piece in the 80s, it only became, more relevant to me as my work sort of, branched out in these different areas. But what my point is that, not only was he shot in the back, by the police, for protests when he was in South Africa, but even like fleeing like these racist apartheid governments, he incurred like this threat of being returned, continuously, and the re-traumatization, because you're never safe, right? It's like in the United States, if you're picked up and you go to trial and then everything is cleared, and then, but what about next week? Because you're still black and you're still walking down the street, and or you're still Native American and you're in Flagstaff. Because when I was in Flagstaff, it's pretty obvious that it's a crime to be Native American in that particular town, right? So that threat, that trauma is always there. It's always just hovering there, waiting to happen. And whether it happens or not, you bear the weight, the psychological burden of those traumas. So, all right. So, this event that occurred in La Jolla in the, sometime in the late 80s, and I can't remember the dates. But that particular assault that I associated with this kind of psychological mechanism of displacement, because, as I said, I couldn't possibly have done anything to make this man so angry, brought me, I experienced it psychologically as reliving this trauma that had occurred in 1977. So I'll talk about that now. Or maybe 76. So 1976 or 1977, I was a young man in junior high school, and most of my education, had been in Oceanside, and I was coming into a new place, and I was an outsider. It's interesting because I wasn't, racially an outsider. What in Oceanside, it was much more diverse community. That Oceanside was, a military town. Camp Pendleton is right nearby, and that's a Marine Corps base. And so there was actually, quite a bit of diversity. There's large African American population, large Mexican American population, not as many other types of communities, but there were some. Whereas in Encinitas, where I was going to junior high school, there was basically like two different groups of people. There were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and they were all surfers, and it was kind of like a drug culture, and then there were Mexican Americans, and by the time you got into high school, they were sort of rival groups, but not as much in junior high. At least I didn't experience it that way, but it may have been part of the way that those groups interacted at that time as well. But anyway, I was in PE class, and it was at the beginning of this semester or beginning of the year, I can't remember which, and we're sitting on the bleachers, and for some reason this group of they were white and I'm white, so that wasn't it, but somehow I registered to them as different. I wasn't part of that culture. If surfing is really a culture, I'm not sure that it can be defined that way, but for them it was definitely a community, and I was definitely not part of it. So and I don't even remember why, they felt it necessary, but I was being, harassed verbally and made fun of, and this bullying is basically what it is, but it was clearly because I was an outsider. For whatever reason that they recognized me as an outsider. So, it's not really in my nature to accept stuff like that and back down. It's just not who I am. So I responded, verbally, and whatever level of insulting, I freely admit that I returned the insults. And so, made the leader of the little group angry, and I was threatened that he was going to beat me up and all this stuff. So I said, okay, so again, I didn't want to fight, but I didn't feel like I really had a choice. What do you do when, okay, it's a very toxic masculinity going on here, right? So picking on the new boy, right? And so it seemed to me that if I didn't fight, that I was going to go through this every day, right? I'd get the bullying every day. And I didn't know what the result of the fight was going to be, but I just didn't want the bullying to continue. So I thought this was really the only option that I had. Now, you could say, well, you should have gone to an authority. Well, I'll talk about that later, okay? But it doesn't work that way. I mean, that sounds great, but it doesn't work that way. Toxic masculinity doesn't go away because you go to the authority. The verbalizing would just become worse. And then, are you going to go and to the to the principal, who's really not going to do anything anyway, and we'll get to that, but and tell them every time someone calls you a name that's insulting? I mean, you would be there all the time. I mean, especially if you're someone that's marginalized in other ways, that if you have a disability, or if you have a speech impediment, or if you happen to be the wrong color, or if you're an immigrant, or whatever it is, right? So, or you have some kind of other marking of difference. If you're not like unmarked within that community, that you're going to incur, more of this abuse. So, just to dispel that idea that there was some like benevolent authority that I could have gone to that would have stopped this. No, there is no benevolent authority, just like there is no benevolent police captain you can go to stop, being harassed by the police, right? There's just not, unfortunate fact, but it's just, that's the way that it is. So, so I'm gonna go, fight this guy. So we're going to do this after school. Well, what I wasn't aware of was that it was going to be a theater. I mean, and I'll describe why it's a theater. And it's a theater retroactively because the Alfred E. Newman, construct says so. But also it's a theater because there were all of these individuals who showed up to watch, right? So there was a space, and it was defined by the bodies of the spectatorship. They literally, the boys, and they were all male, right? This was like a theater of toxic masculinity, and all of these male children, right, like formed a circle, like, so that a space, defining like a space of this theater. That was interesting because it was both a space defined for spectatorship, but also a space defined like so that the participants in the action, the fighters, couldn't really leave, without breaking that sort of fourth wall, because it turned out to be a kind of fourth wall. Now, one of the things that I've been talking about is like participation, intervention versus this kind of passive spectatorship, and I want to complicate that idea a little bit, because this wall that was created by these bodies, was actually like part of the apparatus of involuntary induction into this performance piece, right? Because I hadn't wanted to fight, but I also didn't want to incur this verbal abuse again and again and again and again that I knew was coming. And so I felt like it wasn't really a fair decision that I could make. I was impelled, to take on the burden of this fight, this violence, because there was no avenue of escape. Then the spectacular envelopment in this circle was again a kind of designation of like this involuntary induction into the performance in this theater of violence. And I was like, okay, wow, that is kind of odd. I have a hard time in certain instances performing in front of an audience. I prefer to do things outside, so I'm actually not as good in front of an audience as I might be if there were no audience. So I wasn't looking forward to being on stage in this fight, and I didn't anticipate it, but again, I didn't feel like I had any choice. So, not knowing what the outcome was going to be, I got beaten really, really badly. The kid was really good at fighting. His name was Roger Shevington. That's all I remember about him. And other than that, he was really, really good. I mean, he hit me in ways that I'd never been hit before, like with elbows and knees and, pushing my head into his knee and all these different kinds of moves that, I was not familiar with. I was just some 12-year-old kid or whatever, and not prepared for the level of, of violence and that that went on. But again, so it occurred to me that like this kid who was really, really angry, and pretty good at fighting. Obviously, he didn't just do it this one time. It was a regular thing. Because you don't just develop moves like that in your head. So it occurred to me, not as I was being beaten, but later, that I probably wasn't familiar with the James Joyce story at the time, but I understood the mechanism, intuitively, that something must be going on, that this must be some kind of a displacement of violence directed at him, or anger or discontent, and I didn't know much about the young man, but I assumed that, he wasn't from a place where his experience was very pleasant in order to produce this kind of, violence against someone who was basically just sitting on the bleachers, being an outsider, right? So beyond that, though, the reason that I'm returning to this, and I had spent like a whole day setting up a rationale to return from the assault in the late 80s back to this assault, is twofold. The first is because, when I was assaulted again in the 80s, I re-experienced the trauma of this event and this spectacle. The second is because this spectacle held a key for me in understanding the way that a group of spectators participates psychologically in the events and before them, and maybe I should have probably been aware of this before this moment, but I wasn't. But it seemed to me that this group, first of all, there was a lot of like vicarious pleasure. So there was a kind of like sadism, for the boys that weren't capable of, or that somehow, held themselves back from being part of the violence, but they were allowed to discharge or displace or transfer their feelings of aggression and anger onto the subject who was, pummeling me, so that even though they weren't the ones doing the beating, they were vicariously participating in a kind of displacement by watching him beat me to a pulp, and that was the first aspect of it. And so in this aspect of displacement, um, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. You get the release, right, or the endorphins or whatever it is from the energy of this malignant, affect of anger and violence, and it's a kind of like high, right? I'm sure that it releases a certain amount of chemical energy in the system, although I don't know necessarily what that chemistry is, if it's adrenaline or something else. But so there was a lot of like violent pleasure going on. That was like what held the audience there, and but I also think that and like the other thing that I said about that, and there's no consequences because you can't take these kids to the principal and say, well, hold them all accountable. I was just there watching. I was just a spectacle. And I wanted to get to this point because I wanted to talk about how in Trump's America, like this is the way, like this violence is, right? So for a lot of people, like it's Trump's very malignancy. It's his very malignancy. It's the way that he attacks someone like Greta Thunberg. It's the way that he attacks Colin Kaepernick. It's the way that he attacks any African American or other senator of color, and that produces this like vicarious, pleasure of aggression and violence. That's the appeal, That's the appeal, I think. Right there, and so in any condition in which one feels helpless, and then that helplessness turns to rage or fear, and that fear turns to anger and violence, this can be a kind of drug, this and seemingly without consequences. And then I remember thinking more recently that a lot of the individuals in the January 6th uprising, when Trump lost the election and then encouraged, all this, what is it called, stochastic violence or something like that, encouraged all this violence and rebellion, and then didn't, take the consequences of the blame for that. But they felt the same way, like, I should be pardoned for this because I'm somehow just like living this, fantasy out of this fantasy of proposed and condoned violence, right? So that was one of the things. And then, but I noticed later that, and there may have been for some of the subjects watching, just like in horror cinema, there may have been like a movement of identification back and forth between the participation of sadistic violence and maybe like masochistic identification with me, meaning that maybe they experienced the event from both subject positions, like the desire to be beaten and also punished for what they did. So the cake and eating it too. So you could like beat me and occupy that subjectivity, and then you could be punished for it by like occupying my subjectivity a little bit, so that you wouldn't have to go to the principal. I think that mechanism, makes sense in relationship to this. So like this oscillation back and forth between these two poles as a way of handling malignant affect and participating in this kind of like sadomasochistic subjective identification theater, right? And then beyond the event, in what followed, I remember like all of these like attempts of those that didn't have the courage actually to participate in the violence, to beat me, egging on like responses that would be shameful for me, like some of them, say, well, did you cry? Like this would be like a really effeminate thing if you cried, right? Well, I don't cry when I get hurt. I cry when, someone else gets hurt or someone gets deported or a child is taken away from their parents. So no, I didn't. because none of those things happened, right? I just got hurt. But anyway, and there were other, questions like, or that's the guy that Roger beat up, and pointing, so to put you like, again, like marginalize you even more than you were before, right? And whatever, so I remember feeling like, well, there's all of that, and then you just have to put up with it and bear it. And then if it goes to another fight, you just have to do it again and again and again. So in any case, I didn't report it to the authorities, which would be the principal or someone at the school, because I knew what the results would be, and that's what they were. But someone did. So Roger and I were brought into the office. Now remember, like, I'm telling these stories because in some ways they're all allegories or parables about larger social context, right? I hope that doesn't get lost, because it's really, these are stories that bear upon us because they're easier to understand and contain in these little fragments, when it's not like the whole nation and all of the complexities of what race and immigration and nationality and citizenship mean in the United States. It's easier when it's just Roger and this guy. So I hope that doesn't get lost. But anyway, Roger and I are brought into the office, and we face the authority of the principal, and he asks questions about what our responsibility in this event was, and in the end, this is what happened. In the end, that Roger and I were both punished, and we were both punished in exactly the same way. So and it didn't matter what I said, and I couldn't, at the time, I couldn't even really articulate it in the way that I'm articulating it now, right? I mean, how could I? I was only 12 years old. So I couldn't explain to him that there was no place for me to go, that there was no place for me to hide, that I couldn't just walk away. It sounds very brave. Oh, just walk away, turn the other cheek. You could do that, but you'd be turning the other cheek every day. Every day you'd have to listen to those names. Every day, you'd have to be, and the way that, like, the pack mentality almost like comes in, because like I said, after it happened, then there was like this, what's the word that I want to use? Removal of inhibition, like there was, it's like open season on calling this guy names or pointing to him or saying or asking, did you cry, or more insults, right? So the way had been opened up because there was a sense that, if he got beaten up that time, then maybe he's afraid, to respond to my thing. So these were people with a lot of fear, and I'm not saying that there wasn't a reason for it, but whatever it was, that fear, turned into this kind of toxic masculinity, and there was no reasonable way to get away from it. Like, I wasn't going to go to the principal or the vice principal every time somebody called me a name. There's no way. And but what did happen was, like I said, we were both punished for this fight, like as if that there was equal responsibility, and that that somehow that it had been a decision. You shouldn't have been there, or you shouldn't have spoken back. How do you say you're an African American on the street and a cop calls you one of those words? Like, how do you not respond to that? How do you, like, why do you have to take the long route and not that short vector every time you pass the police station? Why is that fair? Why can't you have the privileges of that unmarked subject that allow you to go from the shortest route from point A to point B? Why do you have to take the ramble every time? And why, if you encounter these injustices, like, is there no authority that you can go to? Now we have a Supreme Court, right? That shouldn't even be the Supreme Court. The members of the Supreme Court are there because basically because Republicans have stolen elections and packed the court. And they're very much, like this principle. So displacements in this psychological sense, it does a number of things. It explains, why the violence arises, and why it's displaced onto these unmarked subjects. Unmarked meaning don't bear the authority of the privilege, right, that certain subjects in the community have, meaning, for the most part, white, propertied males, just like when the U.S. Constitution was written. Not that different, really. And that's one of the reasons why in other pieces I've been addressing issues of ownership and subjectivity, but also what citizenship meant in the Constitution and what it continues to mean as our nation confronts some of this history.